most ancient traditions of spiritual teaching, the knowledge was transmitted in silence, mind to mind, through direct telepathic transmission. Until gradually that capacity for direct mind-to-mind communion began to be lost, and the information could not be reliably passed through that direct drishti, darshan, shaktipat. And so the knowledge then had to begin to be put into conceptual form. But all of the great teachers have said that's very secondary. The real teaching still, even today, has to happen in silence. And the teaching in words is only to raise someone's consciousness up to the point that they can get it through silence. Because until the consciousness becomes so subtle and powerful and trans-individual and non-local, one doesn't have the capacity to receive it. And so Ramana's teaching, for example, was almost all in silence. The teachings, at least that he gave to the real disciples, not the short-term visitors. No, they would get some information or a practice or a mantra or something like that, but the real teaching was given through long periods of darshan. And if you go back to the great sages like Buddha, Buddha's most famous sermon was at Vulture Peak, where he didn't say a word and he held up a flower. That's all he did to all his disciples. And only one disciple got it, what the meaning of that act was, and he handed the flower to Kashyapa. He said, this is the only Buddhist. And he was the one who transmitted the lineage onward. But today we have to speak in words, and yet those words, if they are not filled with the power of silence, will confer little benefit. And if words were enough, then one could read a book and one wouldn't have to come to Arunachala or to another spiritual retreat. But the energy field in which the words are received is more important than the words. And what has to be softened through the energy is the ego's resistance to receiving a kind of information that will dissolve it like an acid, to enable the inpouring and the outpouring of the infinite divine energy. The ego acts like a governor, it does on an engine, to reduce the amount of power that can flow through it. And so even though egos are power hungry, they are so because they lack power and they have fear of power. And that's often because as infants, literally, your mother was afraid of your power. The infant's motor energies and cries and all of that would make the mother anxious. And often the child was put into swaddling clothes, right? So they couldn't even move. Their energies were governed. And the infant could detect very clearly the mother's anxiety over the child's movements. And this would increase as the child could start to walk around the house and get into all kinds of trouble, falling against sharp edges and all of that, right? And those of you who are parents know how you have to baby-proof your house and how you have to watch out for everything and cover plugs and all of this. So the anxiety of the energy, the ungoverned energy of the child, then creates a sense of fear within the child of its own power that doesn't leave it even after it has control over its motor energies and movements and a rational capacity to use its organism in a wise way. And so largely what we need to do is remove that governor on our energy and enable the infinite power to be received. And what governs the energy in its totality is language, concepts and belief systems that tell you what you can and can't do, should and shouldn't do, and inhibit you in many ways that you're not even aware of. And so the process of liberation is a process of disinhibition. But it must be a wise disinhibition, not simply a letting go of your inhibitions of acting out at the lower chakra levels. But we must disinhibit the rising of the kundalini, the sublimation of those energies to the higher levels. That's what's being inhibited in the more important sense. And so the more that the instant gratification impulses are constrained at the lower levels, they mustn't simply be suppressed or repressed, but channeled upward, so that those energies are used not only constructively, but to open up the higher centers of the consciousness, to bring about the joy that has also been inhibited through the ego, as well as the wisdom and the power. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about power, and then because we only have a short time today, I think I would like to devote at least half of our hour to a guided meditation, if you're open to that. Is that okay with people? Okay, because I think that will maybe be more effective than simply a talk. But one of the points I want to get across is that there is only one religion in the world. Even though every culture has its own form, but structurally, those who have analyzed religion and studied comparative religion, Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung, Adolf Bastian, Mircea Eliade, there are many, many famous, well-known writers, Fritjof Schumann. We've read many of them already in our groups. They agree that structurally, when you get behind what Bastian called the folk terminology, the actual structural or archetypal form of the understanding of metaphysical reality is identical, whether in Christianity or Buddhism or Islam or Taoism or Hinduism. It doesn't matter. There are different terms, but those terms refer to the same reality. So it's very important that we not get into some fear of taking in some knowledge that will contradict the religion you were brought up in and feel loyal to or something like that. Whatever you're being taught here will enable you to understand your own religion, whatever you conceive that to be, more deeply, because it is the same. But coming at it, each religion comes at it from a different angle, with a different emphasis, with a different cultural inflection. But it's the same underlying knowledge, and how could it not be? Because we are all from the same source. There's only one God. There's only one Creator. How could there not be the same knowledge being transmitted through the consciousness of everyone, transculturally? And that is true. That has been proven to be the case. But because we're stuck in language, we mistake the signifier for the signified at the ego level, and people fight over whether God is named Allah or Christ or Buddha, and the whole thing is absurd, when in fact they're the same religion. The Palestinians and the Israelis are the same. They're even genetically the same, let alone theologically. And yet they're killing each other. They can't live together. The Pakistanis and the Indians can't get along. All of the conflicts of humanity are absolutely psychotic and irrational, and we can't see it because of being stuck in these egoic territorialities that obscure the unity of truth. So I hope here we can have an island of sanity in which the unity of our being can transcend the differentiality of terminological specificities of our minds and transcend all concepts to the realization of the truth. So, one of the archetypal aspects of metaphysics is the concept of the Trinity. And whether in Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or the Vedic religions, there is an understanding that there is the Godhead that is even superior to God. That is that ultimate, indescribable source that is non-dual. And therefore, because non-dual, beyond any differentiations or descriptions, not even a distinction between existence and non-existence, being or non-being, you cannot make any kind of descriptive categorization or characterization of the ultimate reality. And so in the Indian term, it's Brahman, which just means that which explodes into the universe. But what that is, that creates the Big Bang, is unknowable. Brah means the explosive energy, the power, literally, that emerges from the source. But that Brahman is understood as impersonal. And it is also recognized that the Godhead can be approached as the Supreme Person. And in that term, the word Shiva is used. But it is the same, because whether person or impersonal is also a distinction that cannot be made in absolute reality. And then there's a Trinity that emerges from, or is the first describable way of trying to understand this ultimate reality. And the terms used in the Vedic tradition for the Trinity are Sat, Chit, Ananda. And as the great Catholic saint in India that we have studied, Bede Griffith, has said, that is exactly the equivalent of the Christian Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. The Sat is the Father. It is that beingness that is transcendent, from which the Chit, or the Logos, the intelligence of the Supreme, descends and can manifest in one who is in Christ consciousness. And the Ananda is that energy that is universal, that is the energy of divine love and bliss, that by its nature is everywhere and available to everyone as grace. But these three are all part of the single unity of Shiva, or Brahman. And all of these are forms of power. Sat is the power of being. Chit is the power of mind. Ananda, the power of love and joy, ecstasy, bliss. And at lower states, that love is experienced as compassion, empathy, and the artistic ability to express yourself in music and dance and poetry, or however else. And the Chit becomes the source of science, philosophy, literature, etc. And the Sat becomes the literal power of healing. The energy that at lower levels becomes the prana. And that prana can be transmitted. And there are many, many forms of that transmission, of pranic healing, of Reiki, of so many other ways in which that energy is understood and developed and used for healing purposes in every culture. And all of this is the basis of shamanism, and it's the basis of every process of religious and spiritual development. But if we want to access and be able to use and transmit that energy for the service of the world, for the healing of the world, and of those who come to one specifically for help, then our own individuated minds and bodies and sense of presence must be refined to the point that they can be carriers and channels of that energy. And so that's what we're doing in this process, making ourselves vehicles so that this divine energy can work through us. And doing that is the equivalent of turning an ordinary light bulb into a laser beam. A light bulb can diffuse through the room and light it up, but a laser beam you can do surgery with. You can do incredible things with the power of a laser. And so what we're doing with meditation is learning to concentrate the mind into a single point that is like a laser beam of energy that can then be directed with tremendous power, far more power than your ordinary consciousness has, to affect change in the world. But it is very important that this laser-like energy not be guided by an ego that wants to achieve some egocentric goal rather than the goal of serving God. And so it is built into the structure of consciousness that that capacity for concentration will not actually be given to one who has not transcended the ego. Because the ego acts as the governor that prevents the concentration of your mind. Why do you think you chatter in meditation? It's not an accident. It's actually to keep you from achieving that one-pointedness that would be misused so long as there's an ego. It's a protection. And interestingly, if you study the lives of those great saints of all the traditions, whether Christian or some Eastern tradition, the ones who in particular are known for the power of working miracles, like Padre Pio, whom we studied fairly recently here in the Catholic tradition. People would go to Padre Pio and they would explain to him their problem, whether they had some terrible illness or their brother-in-law had an illness or something like that. Padre Pio would not heal that through some egoic intention, but would pray to God for God to have mercy on that being, and through that, the mediation of the goodwill, the benevolence of that being, because of the power of concentration, the energy would go to help that being, unless there was some karmic reason for that not to happen, and that's why his ego didn't want to get in the way. Maybe that person shouldn't actually have that disease cured. Maybe they need to suffer it and gain wisdom through it. Or maybe they need to die at this point so they'll be reborn and there's a body waiting for them and they can't wait, they'll miss the train, they have to get on the next one. So there are many reasons that any individual human mind would not be able to conceive, and only the mind of God would know if this is the right thing to do. So rather than praying directly for a cure for a person, the prayer would only be for let the best happen. But the amount of energy that would then go toward the benevolence of serving the interests of that being would be increased immeasurably through Padre Pio's intervention. That would very often enable miraculous healings to happen. And the same thing was well known around Ramana. Ramana didn't offer any direct healings, but the number of people who talked about miraculous things happening in his presence or after talking to him and telling him about a certain problem is huge. And even the stories of Ramana bilocating, they're as common as with Padre Pio. That people would have visions of Ramana and even a sense of his physical presence in different parts of India or different parts of the world, for that matter, after he became known throughout the world. And his form could show up. But it wasn't because of some egoic intention of Ramana. In fact, one of his close disciples once asked Ramana about this whole bilocation phenomenon. And Ramana told him about the first time that it happened to him. He didn't know what was going on. He himself was totally confused. He went into a kind of a trance state and he found himself being drawn to another town in India that he'd never gone to. But there was somebody there praying to him for help, sitting in a certain temple in India. And he found himself there and just was giving a darshan to that being and didn't know why he was there or anything. He was kind of like in a semi-trance state, an altered state. He came back into his body later, didn't really know what had happened, because this was the first time it happened to him. But later, the person who received help got a healing and came back from that other town in northern India and said, "Thank you to Ramana." He said, "Oh, is that what happened to me? I get it." He himself didn't understand it, but then it became more common. So it's not a question of the ego desiring this. And all the great sages have always said, don't try to attain any siddhis, any miraculous powers. If you try for that, then your ego will get very inflated as to how great you are. So all must be surrendered to God. But the more that you are surrendered to God and the will of God flows through your own intelligence, the more these things will happen. But the credit for all of it goes to God, not to any individual. And the only reason that it can happen is that the whole universe is miraculous. And it is all the product of a single power of intelligence and love and beauty. That is the reason for all of this existing in the first place. So spiritual development consists then in the training of the mind to sublimate the impulses that would otherwise act out in the level of body consciousness for sensual enjoyments and temporary pleasures, to be focused upon the supreme level of consciousness. And then in that supreme level of consciousness, what you will recognize is that what you are is simply a mass of consciousness. And the word mass is, of course, not exactly apt, since there is no mass to consciousness. But the power of that consciousness in its most concentrated form is incredibly dense. I wouldn't call it a black hole, but I would call it perhaps a white hole of incredibly dense divine light. And that light has the capacity to radiate power in all directions, in all dimensions. And as one is centered in that state of completely wordless, silent presence as the container of that incredibly massive, dense, infinite energy field, then whatever happens in the world that seems to require some benevolent action or offering of love, of generosity, of empathy, or whatever, will send a ray of that energy in that direction for the help of the world. And it will be a natural emanation, just like there are flares coming out from the sun. These emanations will come from the sun of consciousness that you are. And they will automatically, spontaneously happen in ways that will be of help to the world. And this is the ultimate level of karma yoga. It has nothing to do with what the body is doing, washing the dishes or whatever, which is wonderful. And we can't have a community without that. But the question is, while the body is washing dishes, is the consciousness in that state of infinite solar power, so that the rays of benevolent light are flowing into this creation. And the shift that happens, that we refer to with this term, ego death, is the shift from the belief that you are a creature in a created world to realizing that you are one with the Creator. And that this world is the place of the reception of that energy of divine love. And as the solar energy from the heart of consciousness is given to the world as a gift of love, one is then actually participating as the whole Trinity. One is Satchidananda. One is that beingness of the light itself, the intelligence of knowing where that energy must flow to for the optimal benevolent outcome for the world, and the love of the world that is the creative reflection of one's being. And in abiding as that state of infinitely powerful divine love, light, that is the ultimate fulfillment and realization of one's being.